I'd like to welcome our first guest speaker, Dr. Stephen Bullivant. Stephen is a theologian and sociologist based at St. Mary's University in London and also at the University of Notre Dame, Australia. So it seems like you travel quite a lot. He is a Catholic convert and ex-nun, and his books include The Trinity, How Not to Be a Heretic, Mass Exodus, Catholic Disaffiliation in Britain and America since Vatican II, and Non-Verts, The Making of Ex-Christian America. I highly recommend that one. It is very readable. My husband Matthew and I were laughing our heads off in the car on a road trip when I was reading it out loud. So you can learn a lot and be highly amused. So please welcome Dr. Bullivant for his talk today, The U.S. Church in an Age of Secularization, Past, Present, and Possible Futures.
Well, first of all, it's a huge honor to be here. It's a thrill to see all of you here. And I just want to thank Lizzie and everyone else, but it's Lizzie's the sort of the one that you end up dealing with, just for creating this and inviting me, and Angela, and this is just great. This is one of those titles that's sort of ludicrously overambitious for 40 minutes. So I think if we kind of take it seriously but not literally, I believe is the phrase. And kind of see where we get to. I think my main intention for this first bit really is to give you something to talk about in the breakout sessions, which is, I think, is probably the more important bit of the morning, frankly, both in terms of kind of the social element, which is we'll get talked to, but also, you know, the idea is that, well, I mean, the possible futures is you, basically. So it's far more important what you guys make of all this. Do I have a clicker? Just thought. Oh, I can just literally click. Yeah. Okay. I do that. Right. So, secularization is in one sense, a very complicated term that can be both a sort of a statement of fact, the fact of, broadly speaking, religious decline, that religion used to be much more popular, powerful, persuasive than it is now. There's a huge sort of theorizing around secularization, why it happens, whether it's inevitable, kind of all sorts of questions, but sort of, if you like, the brute fact of secularization is that places used to be more religious and they're now less religious. And there's various things that go into that. Probably the kind of the standout signal, if you like, that we have from all sorts of data sources is simply the rise of the nons over the past, and it depends how you date it. This is the General Social Survey, which is normally regarded as the gold standard of, you know, social research, and it's been being asked since the 1970s, which is helpful for it. Basically speaking, the nons were at a time when elsewhere in kind of other quasi-comparable countries, nowhere is really comparable to the United States. But if you look at Britain, if you look at France, if you look at Germany, if you look at Australia, if you look at Canada, by the 1990s, the proportion of people who said they have no religion in the population was much higher. For Britain, it was certainly around 40%. It's over 55, 60% now. But in the United States, which, you know, the most modern, the most kind of, not quite, well, yeah, the most futuristic country, if you like, because the idea was that secularization, as modernity happens, as countries modernize in all the various ways that can happen, technologically, culturally, politically, then they become less religious. But America sort of stubbornly refused to do it. And the question was always, well, is it America that's the exceptional case, or is it the rest of the world? Is Europe the exceptional case? And then, 30, 40 years after everyone else had, not everyone else, but those kind of quasi-comparable countries, the American data really kind of shot up and kept shooting up. So different data sources track it slightly differently, we're about to see. But certainly by the time you get to the mid-1990s, the late 90s, the proportion of people who said they had no religion had kind of doubled. And then since the early 2000s, it's just every year it's kind of gone up, up, and up, and up. So currently, it depends how you ask the question, but around 27% of US adults say they have no religion. But among under 30s, you lot, it's about 40%. Now, obviously, America is a very big and diverse country. This will look very different depending not only what bit of the country and what state you're in, but, you know, whether you're in a small town or in a big city or in a college town, you know, there's all sorts of microclimates. But this is a big aggregate. And probably, yes, there's parts of the country that are much more religious than other parts. But actually, what you tend to find is that the more religious parts are still less religious than they were 30 years ago. And the less religious parts are even less religious than they were 30 years ago. If that makes sense. Now, as I say, this is one kind of data source. Going to do it for me. There we go. This just lines up lots of different data sources, each asking the question slightly differently. Religious identity is a very complicated thing. If you ask the question slightly differently, in a population where lots of people, you're always going to get some people who will always tick the Catholic box no matter how you ask the question. You always get a certain proportion of people who will tick no religion, kind of no matter how you phrase the question. But there's a big chunk of people in the middle in secularizing societies who can think, well, on the one hand, yeah, I suppose I am Catholic, I was baptized, we sort of sometimes went to church. We're an Irish family, so it's a really big thing for grandma or great-grandma by now. If I do get married or when I do get married, you know, I want it to be in a church. But can also think, well, to be honest, I don't really know what I believe. I certainly don't believe some of the things that the church believes. Frankly, I don't even know what my parents believe. We only went to church when grandma was in town. I totally disagree with what the church did on this, or this. So there's a sense in which a lot of people can tell two very honest stories about themselves as being either totally not religious or some kind of Catholic or Baptist or Methodist or whatever. And depending on how you ask the question, you end up nudging kind of a fairly big chunk of the population in a certain direction. But what we find is that because we've got different kind of very reputable survey places asking the same phrasing of questions over time, Gallup tends to get a low proportion. Something called the Congressional Election Study tends to get a high proportion. The General Social Survey tends to be in the middle. So depending on how the survey is asked, how the question is phrased, anywhere between about more than a third to about a quarter of the United States adult population say they have no religion. And it's especially from about here, it's obvious that all these different ways of tracking it have been sort of tracking the same underlying phenomenon, but kind of in their different ways, if that makes sense. And if you go back, we've got Gallup data going back to the early, well, the late 40s even. For most of, you know, the first 20, 30 years, the people who said they had no religion in the US population was about 1 to 2%. Then it leapt up a bit in the 60s, leapt up again in the 70s, 80s, stayed there, and then something happens in the 90s, 2000s. And, well, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but it's probably going to keep going for some time. Who are the nons? Well, when you talk about a third to a quarter of the population of the United States, there's a sense in which they're everybody. Religious change in a population can happen in all sorts of ways: immigration, differential birth rates, conversions. The vast majority of American nons kind of non-verts, so they were raised as some kind of religion. If you ask them in what religion, if any, were you brought up, questions like this, they'll tick one of the religious boxes, normally a kind of Christianity, of course. And if you ask them what religion they regard themselves as having now, they say none. So out of probably 60 odd million American nons, you get 16 million ex-Catholics. And as far as the church is concerned, sacramentally speaking, these are not ex-Catholics. You can't be an ex-Catholic. It's like the Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave, which is one of those pop culture references that is just perfect for a room full of 20-somethings. 7.5 million ex-Baptists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, because of the way we tend to carve up American religious diversity, you can either say that most American religious nons are ex-Protestants, which is true, or if we say, well, Protestants just an enormously large category, and it doesn't make much sense to kind of compare them all as one big thing. So you can equally say that the largest chunk of American nons are former Catholics, or what you might call subjectively former Catholics, that they see themselves as being ex-Catholic. And actually, that's a very significant social phenomenon. You know, sacramentality aside, the fact that people who say they were raised Catholic, which there's a huge spectrum of what that can mean in practice, but at least baptism, and probably in many cases, a great deal else besides, the fact that 16 million of them feel sort of so far from the church to no longer even tick the box. And normally speaking, that box is the last thing to go. So it's quite common for people who don't believe, don't practice, kind of have no real connection in any meaningful way with the church they grew up in, not just a Catholic thing, but they'll still tick the box. They'll still think, well, yeah, I guess Catholic. Since the late 90s, a bigger and bigger proportion of the American population have thought, well, actually, nah, not really anything. And this is why. And again, this is one of those horribly complicated, it's not that horribly complicated, it's far too complicated at this time of the morning. But we get a sense of how this, ignore Britain, pretend you're the media. So this is the only place that counts. Obviously, this plays out differently in different generations. This is the millennials and the early Gen Zs, or whatever you call yourselves. I don't know. Regular practice here. So this is a proportion of people who say they were raised Catholic and kind of what they are now when they were asked in the survey. And the survey, when I did this, I couldn't be bothered doing it again because it was quite a lot of work. It's not that long ago. This is from one of the books. Roughly 3 in 10 millennials, if you like, and a bit later, who say they were raised Catholic. Now, what's termed here regular practice. Regular practice means at least, they say they go to mass at least monthly. They say they go to church at least monthly. If you narrowed that down to kind of people who say they go at least weekly, it's probably half that. So if you think that there's probably, out of every 100 people who say they were raised Catholic, born after about 1985, 15 say they go to mass every week, and 25, 30 say they have no religion. So being raised Catholic in America in the past 40 years, you're twice as likely to be a non as you are to be a weekly practicing Catholic, which probably isn't a very good growth strategy for any organization. So there's a sense in which people who don't practice, who don't believe, who have very kind of no connection to whatever religion it is, to move from ticking the religious box to ticking the non-religion box. There's a sense in which that's a kind of not a big thing. right? And so there was a Babylon Bee headline about, people who, sort of non-Christians, just now more honest. So the idea is that this isn't a real change. This is just people who weren't actually Christians now no longer ticking a box on a survey. But in fact, it's a huge change, because what it tells you is that as a society in which even the people who don't believe and don't practice still tick some kind of Christian box, tells you something about the overarching Christian religious atmosphere, vibes, if you like, of a society. And the fact that now those exact same people think of themselves as having no religion really shows how far along a path of secularization the country's gone. And it's not something, we're going to talk about this in a second, it's not something that suddenly started in the 90s, right? You don't suddenly get people sticking no religion out of nowhere. What we see is that the rise of the nons is the culmination of 30, 40 years of religious decline in other areas. How does this play out? Okay, people ticking boxes on surveys, identity is one measure. But if all it was people ticking boxes on surveys, but the churches were as full as ever, confession lines were as full as ever, evangelical youth clubs were, like the whole American, panoply of religious strength and diversity was the same as ever, then you think, well, it's just an identity thing. It's interesting, it's sociologically interesting, but it's not itself a signal about religious decline. There's other signals. This is well, you've read it. This is the Diocese of Rochester average mass attendance statistics. A few years ago, for a book called Mass Exodus, I emailed every diocese in the United States and asked them for their typical Sunday mass data. Not everyone replied. Not everyone has it or collects it, apparently. I found that very hard to believe. Some dioceses, even huge archdioceses like Chicago, say, well, we've only been collecting it since the 90s, but here you are, have it, you're welcome to it. Some have been collecting it since the 50s. Any one diocese is its own thing with its own unique set of circumstances and whatever. But in the aggregate, certainly in this part of the country, this doesn't look dissimilar to probably dozens of other dioceses. Other parts of the country, we're going to see a healthy growth, right? But overall, there's probably more of these than there are of the healthy growth. Okay, and as I say, this is this diocese. So, quarter of a century ago, there was about 105,000 people at Mass in the Diocese of Rochester every Sunday. Now, there's about 32,000. COVID hits around here, obviously. That was just before COVID. That was the first quarter of the year before the pandemic really hit. It was probably down there. And interesting, this isn't bad. A lot of places in a lot of parts of the world have lost a big chunk of people more than you would have expected if you just followed the trend, right? So there's a sense in which Rochester has just rebounded back to more or less where you might have thought they would have been if you just followed that trend along. We'll talk about following trends into the future later, but this is the pastoral hand that bishops, clergy are dealt. But this is the situation that you and lots of other people are living. It's a very different experience to go to a church that's mostly full on a Sunday to one that's mostly empty. Think if you ever go to a gig, a small room that's packed feels very different to a bigger room that's much more sparsely populated, even if there are more people in the bigger space. It just feels different. So this is why we consolidate parishes, this is why we merge things, but even so, this is kind of what you're living, right? And as I say, this is, I've not picked the Diocese of Rochester because it's a standout example. Partly picked it because they just had the data and sent it me. I mean, and it just so happened that it was here. Now, there's a big backstory that far too in-depth to kind of go into with any detail. And you can always push the story back further. Okay, so if you say, well, which is what I've tended to do, is to say, well, the big change happens after the second one. And it takes a long time to work through, and it's not a kind of like a conveyor belt that, once that happened, therefore that happened, therefore that happened. But I think you can tell what I think is quite a plausible story beginning in the late 40s, which was a huge period of religious boom. The 1960s is probably the slightly closer in time, big event where things noticeably begin to change. And they begin to change for all sorts of reasons. Okay? Beginning in the 1960s and certainly into the 1970s, we begin to see quite serious religious decline in certain areas of the American religious landscape, particularly Catholic churches and Protestant mainline denominations. Evangelicals are doing their own thing. Other groups are doing their own thing. But things start biting in the 60s, 70s. And if you do have diocesan data that goes back that far, it's kind of every year, no matter what they do, year on year. It's only 1%. You don't notice it year on year, okay? Because it's only 1%. If you've got a congregation of 500, there's 5 fewer people the next year, 5 fewer people the following year. You do that for 40, 50 years, 60 years now, it's a serious, end up with a serious problem. So that had happened in the 60s. There's all sorts of other stuff going on. The way the council hits, particularly among the Catholic things, but of course you've got lots of denominations that don't have a council, don't give up fish on Fridays, don't have humanity. There's all sorts of stuff, and they're not looking much better. Okay, the religious church-going kind of religious vitality was much higher than Protestant mainline in the 50s, 60s. So it's come down from a higher level. But this is not just a Catholic story. I think there is a specific Catholic story to tell, but it's not just a Catholic story. Also, that happened in the 1960s is that you get a growing moral, cultural chasm opening up between what you might think of as traditional Christian morality on all sorts of issues, but most particularly deeply personal ones around marriage and family, around abortion, around divorce, around same-sex relationships. And over time, that's grown and grown and grown. So there's a very serious disjunct between what the Catholic Church still teaches, what a lot of mainline Protestant denominations used to teach, and now there'll be a breakaway denomination that still teaches and another one that no longer teaches it. But the sort of the wider, you can track this on social surveys looking at moral attitudes. You can track this on, you can watch, if you watch kind of sitcoms from the 50s or 60s to the present day, you kind of see this. So there's a big shift. Again, it doesn't happen suddenly, but now to be a Catholic or an evangelical or a traditional Episcopalian who believes what your church teaches is to put you sort of very radically at odds on certain issues with other people in the pews, but certainly with the wider culture, with people in your family, with your friends, with all sorts of. And that's not to say that there was some sort of time in America, the 50s, 60s, where everyone agreed, Everyone got along, everyone. But, you know, we talk about culture wars, and that's not just religious, moral issues, but it's part of it. And growing polarization, and there's a kind of a church version of that, which has big effects. And yet, despite all this, despite religious decline, despite this growing chasm, the proportion of Americans who say they have some kind of religion stubbornly solid until it isn't. My argument is that the precise way in which the Cold War framing, if you like, played out in America was very different to how it was in Europe and other places. We had a Cold War. You know, we had, in fact, literally, my daughter plays sort of 10 minutes drive away on what used to be an American Air Force base in a little village in Oxfordshire where you used to keep your nuclear bombs to take to Moscow. Now, obviously, if things had kicked off, that little Oxfordshire village, 10 minutes from my house, would have been on the list of targets of the Soviets. So it's not that, that Europe, in fact, obviously Europe was much closer to everything, and things kicked off. Things were going to kick off in Europe in a big way, right? But it was not framed in the religious terms that it was in America. It wasn't framed as godless communism versus Christian America, the Christian free world. British films were not framed in the way that, like, whatever the Rocky film is where he goes and beats the big kind of Soviet guy and that gets wrapped in an American flag and all that kind of stuff. If you ever watch Star Trek, and given that this is Cornell, given that we're in the physical science building, I suspect some of you will have seen Star Trek. The Borg are clearly meant to be the Soviets. The Borg, who are this kind of like, they assimilate you into this mass, is meant to be, a playful metaphor of the Soviet bloc versus the free world, with the good guys. Wasn't framed like that in Europe. My argument, it's not the only thing that's contributing, is that this was a significant reason why people in America who didn't practice, didn't believe, or certainly didn't know what they believed, didn't know what they kind of practiced very irregularly, if at all, still thought of themselves as some kind of Christian, still tick the box. For sort of a generation or two after, in other parts of the world, people had stopped ticking that box. Obviously, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, stops that. The generation who come of age, the millennials, are mostly raised after the Cold War. And of course, there's a new enemy in town, not people with no religion, but people with too much religion, people with too much extreme religion. And then after 9/11, it becomes very easy to say, well, the problem is religion. And if you read the new atheist authors, which are 20 years old now, it's very explicitly framed as, we wouldn't have this problem. If it wasn't for religion, we'd still have the Twin Towers. This is very explicitly framed. In Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris said he started writing The End of Faith the day on September 12th, right? And it becomes, that opens up a space for that in mainstream chat shows, in the bestsellers list, in episodes of South Park. There's kind of this really weird atheist cultural moment, right? Which kind of opens up the possibility, not necessarily of being as kind of Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris atheist, but for people to say, oh, I'm not as extreme as them, but yeah, I guess I'm not religious. I guess I'm one of these nons that I keep reading about in the press. Talked about that already. And of course, as I say, big religious decline had been going on in the Catholic Church, the mainline Protestant denomination, since the 60s, far less so in evangelicalism, fundamentalism, Mormonism, plenty of kind of staunch religious holdouts, partly because they were able to create their own subcultures. If you were raised in a small town, Southern Baptist town in Texas, probably everyone you knew was some kind of Southern Baptist. All the kids at your public high school, not all of them, but there was a significant critical mass of evangelicals. You had your own TV shows. You had your own music industry. You had your own movies. You had your own version of WWF wrestling, because you weren't allowed to watch WWF wrestling, but there were these guys called the Power Team who were like beefcakes for Jesus. And there's if you ever want sort of 90s vibes videos, Power Team videos from the 1990s are just pure cringe 90s kind of aesthetic. But there was this you could kind of live out your life in this evangelical kind of world, in the same way that if you were raised in parts of America in the 1940s, 30s, you could live your life in a Polish Catholic bubble, or an Irish Catholic bubble, or an Italian Catholic bubble. Okay. The internet stops that in a big way. If you're in like rural Utah and you have doubts, you don't really have anywhere to go, because all the sort of the materials that you read, everything at the school, everything at the library, is LDS approved materials. Anyone who isn't at least a conforming LDS kind of person gets the hell out of rural Utah. And you have no, you might know that there's some cousin who we don't see anymore, but you literally don't see them anymore. With the internet, if you're having doubts, you've got a whole internet full of doubters, full of people who are just like you. And you get the possibility of these kind of close-knit kind of support groups, if you like. And that's not just a religious thing. You get the possibility of all kinds of niche special interests with people like you who are all into fanficking Lord of the Rings, or all into whatever, right? But that starts to take its toll on evangelicals and LDS. And then the other big thing that happens as the abuse crisis hits in the Catholic Church first, but we've seen it kind of everywhere. And that kind of hits on top of everything that's already happening. So by the early 2000s onwards, we get no religion becomes a thing. And a lot of people read headlines and think, oh, that's probably what I am. So the next year, more of them tick the box. That's where we are now. What happens next? Well, lots of stuff. This hasn't finished. You're going to see Rise of the Nones going for some time. I've seen it argued by sensible people that we might be beginning to see the kind of the flattening out, the sort of the tailing off of the rise, at least. It's not going to go down, but we're sort of seeing it. Even so, that's going to work its way up through the population. So like older people who are more religious are going to be, replaced when they die by the younger generations who are less religious. So we're still going to see the rise, but we're not going to see this sort of meteoric rise. Maybe. But we're certainly going to keep seeing it for a while yet. You'll sometimes see, if present trends continue, the last Methodist in America will die in 2064. It's nonsense. Like, present trends don't continue. Like, they can't. There's no plausible situation where you sort of follow the Diocese of Rochester down to zero, by 2032 or something, right? Just doesn't make any possible kind of sense. So secularization is a process. It can't go on forever. It won't go on forever. So there has to come a point when it stops. And then there's a sense in which, the only way's up from that point. Okay. And we're beginning to see that in places much further along, like Britain. We're not there yet, but I think we're beginning to see the inflection. What I did, inflection. You see it in places like Sweden, and much kind of more secular, much sort of further along the journey. If you're a Christian in these places, especially if you're a young Christian, it's not Catholic specific. For a start, you're probably only ticking the box if it means something. But if you're attending church regularly, if you're in your 20s and you go to church regularly in Britain, you have to have been swimming against the tide. You have to be there for a reason. There's just no other reason why you would be. And you find yourself in a room full of other 20-something British Christians who have been swimming against the tide, who have to be there for a reason or else they wouldn't be there. And actually, that's the sort of groups where we begin to see growth. You're not going to suddenly rebound again, but you're going to see strength and growth and resilience, and kind of gradual, increase. Immigration always helps. Like, people from lots of places in the world where immigrants come from tend to be more religious. They may not stay religious forever, like in the next generation will be assimilated, which is always the idea with immigration, I guess. It's not like, oh, we've got some Vietnamese people, so they're going to keep 90% mass-going rates forever. That's not going to happen, but you've got a constant, Britain's always had this, the Catholic population, it's constantly been topped up by immigration, which is great. Keeps churches open, it keeps, a new, more committed group to at least pass some of that into the next generation. It won't be a perfect transmission. The question is, well, what happens to the generation after that? But actually, that's a good problem to have. And really, this is the key thing. This is the thing I just mentioned before, is that what happens at the end of decline is that the people who are left have to be strong, have to be there for a reason. If you have nothing better to do on a Saturday in upstate New York than come here and listen to me, you're not here because it's cool. You're not here because, oh, wow, Stephen Bullivant's in town. Wow, that's gonna go straight on Insta. I might get a selfie. It's gonna be amazing. No one here is for that. You're here because you believe it, or because it's important to you, or you're hanging out with a group of people who believe it and for whom it's important, and you're kind of tagging along and you're not quite sure, which is great. But that's the kind of thing. If you your age demographic, you're from all over the country, some of you be from all over the world, at least at the second generation level. It's very hard to paint a single story, right, that kind of captures everyone. But your age demographic, your part of the country are kind of at the vanguard of secularization. Okay? And the fact that you're here suggests that there's a reason why you're here. And there's this quotation from G.K. Chesterton, some of you will have heard before: a dead thing can go with the stream, but only a living thing can go against it. And what you tend to find with these groups, and it's not just a religious thing, but what you tend to find with these groups is that they tend to become more committed because you're kind of hanging out with people and you encourage each other. People start talking about vocation. People start thinking seriously about kind of how do we live out our life as a Catholic or as an evangelical in a meaningful way in a society in which that's not easy to do. So there's a kind of an intentionality about it and an intensity. It's not easy. It won't be easy. And, when some of you often have kids and want to raise them to have the same kind of commitment as you do, because you're grateful to have found it and regard it as important, it's going to be difficult because that's the bigger culture. But that's why this generation is critical. And I'm just going to go very quickly through the last little bits. We don't care about that. Just to say that, there's a whole wealth of, it's not just me sort of saying random ideas I've had. There's a whole kind of social scientific theory about groups of like-minded people kind of doubling down and, really getting into things in a serious way. I always think vinyl records, the sales of vinyl have declined, right? Vinyl is record, old school, big black records, right? If you're still buying vinyls 50 years into that decline, you're really into vinyl. And the guys it's probably guys, the guys you hang out with are really into vinyl, right? And the internet was amazing for you because suddenly there was lots of people who were really into vinyl, and you've become more really into vinyl because you're hanging out with other guys who are really into vinyl. And there's all new, the vinyl industry is now booming precisely because of this kind of weird, kind of countercultural vinyl guy thing. And you can multiply that in all kinds of other groups. My favorite examples are hardcore environmental protesters. These are people. This is like the what would you call it? The highway, right? The big motorway, right? That goes right around the most busiest motorway in the country. I'm nearly finished, but the busiest. I like these ones. The biggest motorway in the country. Rush hour in the morning. These are guys who run out into the middle of the motorway and I don't know what you call it, gorilla glue themselves to the motorway, right? You have to be pretty committed to do that, but you have to hang out with a group of people who think, yeah, this is a really great thing to do. We have to do this. It's the most important. This is the most important thing we can possibly do with our lives. You don't just do that by yourself. Okay. Male My Little Pony fans, right? If you were a male My Little Pony fan before the internet, you probably didn't know any others. Why not? How would you? You wouldn't dress like that and walk around and find, oh, dude, right? Now, don't do a Google image search without being very careful about filters, because there's areas of this that I think demons fear to tread, but certainly like well, a trigger warning, shall we say. But once the internet comes along, it's possible for male. It's a good show. I mean, I've got daughters, so that's why I've seen it. That's why but before that, it's very hard to get the kind of hardcore community of fellow male My Little Pony fans. You need to have conventions of tens of thousands of male My Little Pony, right? And also, like, you don't start, you don't begin at that level. You're like, oh, that was a pretty good show, ooh. You go down a rabbit hole and end up there, right? So it's not just a religious thing. The same kinds of social dynamics, if you like, are at play in all sorts of areas. And as I say, this is the very last thing. In Britain, we're beginning to see it. This is frequency of mass attendance among the big survey we did a few years ago in Britain. There's several things that feed into this, but look, that's the baby boomers. Being raised Catholic in those days, not a big chance of still identifying as Catholic later on. The younger generations, at least if you're still ticking the box, then you have to be committed or you're not ticking that box. And if you're hanging out at Catholic chaplaincies, and the same thing will be true of evangelical chaplain, Christian unions. You find your tribe, if you find your gang, I don't know what you even call it these days. Then you all encourage each other. And that's the kind of group that attracts it. So we're beginning to see it. Places that are much further along secularization than you guys, we're beginning to see the upturn. That's trying to shill some books. And that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We have about 10 minutes for open Q&A here, and then after that, we'll go into our breakout groups. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and Jacques will take this microphone for you so that our Zoom friends can also hear the question.
I didn't know there's people on Zoom. I'd have sort of not wandered around as much. Sorry.
I can speak out. Hi, Stephen. Amazing talk. I really got to think about a lot of stuff. I'm curious, there was one thing that I really feel that was leading to these problems that you were talking about that you didn't address. And that was, I think, a lack of character from the Catholic Church these days. With the growth of information, we're about to know about the scandals within the Catholic Church in terms of sexual scandals, corruption, and maybe a lack of character from certain individuals who are part of the clergy, but the Catholic institution as a whole decides to protect them. I come from India. People, clergy who do murder or are sexual harassment, are on trial for sexual harassment or sexual rape. uh, the Catholic Church sends the best lawyers in India to protect them. So the Catholic Church has money to spend there, but when they want to give one bag of rice to the poor villager in town, they want to come to my home and ask for donations. So, and you can go, I'm sure you're aware about Bishop Marcial and, all of that stuff.
And number of others.
Yeah, and number of others. I don't want to get into the details because we could keep going on that. I mean, why doesn't the Catholic Church now own up to it, or even speakers like you decide to address those issues and tackle those sides as well? And what are your thoughts about this? And in terms of leading to a secularization of people not wanting to identify as Catholic or with the church, what contribution do you think these things also have to that?
Yep. Well, huge. I mean, thank you. I mean, that's totally. I mean, I mentioned it briefly, and it's one of those things that came on top of everything else. Okay. And then when it did, and this becomes critical in the rise of the non, because it's perfectly possible to keep. I don't know what I believe, but being Catholic's quite an important family, cultural. There used to be this thing about Catholic identity is sort of tribal, and once a Catholic, always a Catholic. And even if you're an atheist Catholic, you still, like there's that kind of thing. That's kind of gone, right? Maybe it lingers longer in sort of second generation immigrant because it's a bigger thing in the background. But absolutely, the critical thing that happens is this kind of total counter witness by the church. And yeah, I mean, we could sit here and just name dozens. And over a long period of time, I mean, like the Boston Globe revelations, the Spotlight stuff was 2002. That was by no means the first. I mean, that became a big thing because it was national media. The internet meant that you couldn't keep scandals in regional news silos, right? And if before the internet, you might read a couple of articles in the New York Times in a year or whatever paper you read. Whereas by 2002, this could be sort of instant wall-to-wall coverage. And it's only then that the church kind of says, well, we're definitely doing something about it now. Yeah, we need to draw a line. And 20 years later, we've had endless, McCarrick is just the most prominent, but there's plenty of others. And you're right that in other countries, at kind of various stages along that process. And it's not just a Catholic issue, but it's a huge Catholic, and the Archbishop of Canterbury in England has resigned in the past few days for precisely that kind of not handling things and moving people around or just turning a blind eye or just assuming it's fine now. And it's a huge counter witness. I've done some work on this. There's always more work to be done. And yeah, I mean, why doesn't the church clean, yeah.
Just to add, I think if the church doesn't take responsibility, I as a believer sort of have to not just defend my religion in front of my friends, but have to defend why I have to support an organization that permits these stuff.
Totally. And that's absolutely valid. And it's that kind of thing. But what you tend to see is that the people who are more kind of committed, more connected with the church, have more reasons to stay. So you'll often, but they're also hurt more by it. It means more to them, partly because they're probably more likely to know people, more likely to be connected to parishes where there's been a scandal. So it's they feel it more deeply, but they also have more reasons to carry on regardless. That's not everyone, but
yeah.
Whereas the people who have only a very loose connection to the church, which by now is a lot of Catholics, and you can say the same about other denominations, for them, all of this just totally poisons the brand. So like in the past, you might think, yeah, being an Irish Catholic is like Guinness and like leprechaun hats. And it's a big kind of family thing. And it's a thing we take pride in. When the brand is paedophile priests and covering up them and all that, that's not something you want to have your tick box associated with. So absolutely, it's huge.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Stephen.
Hello again.
So I thought that the example of My Little Pony was really amusing.
Good. Because if you didn't, then that would really have failed as an example. Like,
exactly. But one of my fears among sort of this like Catholic group polarization phenomenon among young adults is that maybe Catholicism becomes more like, you know, I have brass candlesticks in my dorm room and I carry around a copy of Brideshead Revisited that I don't read. And I tell my friends I'm learning Latin, as opposed to like sincere faith in Jesus Christ and like doing good works and that kind of thing. Do you worry that this is more of a, do you worry about translating sort of the cultural, aesthetic, artistic phenomenon into like, you know, good old time religion? Do you worry about that at all with the group polarization phenomenon?
to an extent, except, I mean, first of all, I think it's perfectly possible to carry around Brideshead Revisited and be into all that and have a very deep faith in Jesus, and it's huge. And
of course,
and
yeah, of course.
That's always a thing. I think there's sort of pathology, you know, there's pathologies in any kind of group. I think the saving grace of the Catholic Church is actually how broad it is. And there's a kind of, if you like, an internal market. Like that can be your thing. Like you can be really into that and you can find other people who are really into that and that's totally your thing. But there's any number of other versions of authentic Catholicism that look very different, right? So you can find your kind of, in a big city, it's much easier to do in a big city because if there's a big city, there'll be, you know, lots of vibrant, you know, full churches, with their own kind of liturgical style, their own preaching, their own kind of, their own thing. Some of those will be there, the Eastern, you know, some of those are kind of obviously different things. But actually some of them, there's just a different kind of cultures from parish to parish or from congregation to congregation in the same parish. I mean, you're going to get a different feel at the 6 p.m. You know, it's a different crowd to the 11 p.m. high mass kind of crowd. So yeah, in, you know, in any group, there's always the possibility of it not being about the thing that it's meant to be about. But equally, I do think that the kind of the cultural trappings, if you like, often help scaffold the important stuff. And I think the danger that, I think one of the things that, one of the big missteps after the council was there was a sort of a well-meaning hope that, well, if we kind of clear away all the other stuff, the mass becomes much more important in people's lives. There was a feeling that devotions, you know, rosary, all sorts of distraction, literally framed as distractions from the main event, was kind of a zero-sum game. But actually, I think what we found was that because Catholics are humans too, right? There's that whole sort of paraphernalia that goes around it actually is very important in creating a, you know, not necessarily a culture, but either a subculture or your own personal way of being a thing. And it's again, it's these sort of like cringe middle-aged dad pop culture references, right? But there's a sense in which, you know, being a Taylor Swift fan is about the music, right? Well, my daughter, I've got a daughter who's not particularly into the music any more than she's in any other thing, but she likes making bracelets.
Yeah.
She likes the whole kind of thing that goes around it, and that's a part of it. So I think there's sort of it's not a fandom thing, but there's sort of analogs where you can say, well, it used to be about the music, but it's no longer, you know, that actually helps, and it's always possible that it is a distraction. But I think on balance, you know, if guys want to dress in tweed and smoke pipes and talk about Tolkien and Chesterton, which is a really weird, you get a lot of them in those study abroad programs in Oxford, right? There's a big evangelical thing of people wanting to be like C.S. Lewis and that kind of thing, and there's a big kind of Catholic thing, right? Tolkien and Chesterton. You know, why not? Like, you know.
Yeah, I guess, you know, does it lead to faith, I guess?
I think actually, given yeah, it probably does, because if nothing else, I mean, maybe some guys are just in it for the tweed and the pipe. Like, you know, like what, you know, what's the draw there? You're not in it for the babes or like, or you know, like whatever or the money or the street cred, right?
Yeah.
But it's actually bringing you into at least proximity to the real thing. And actually, I think that the difficulty these days is that unless you have a particular reason to be at Mass, there's very little other things that might get you there by accident, if that makes sense. So I think all of that is probably on balance good.
I agree. Thank you.
So that's one question for this open group. Kind of discuss this in a bigger Sir Stephen at lunch. So let's take one more question here. I think I saw over here.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first question is, how does the Catholic religious leaders, how are they concerned about the vocation, especially in the current generation? Because you find a situation whereby we have a group of individuals whom we know, we grew up with them, we know their characters, but when it reaches a certain level, you hear like so-and-so has joined maybe priesthood but these are people that to some extent, though we should not judge, but to some extent we feel that if you follow their way, then you are going to follow the wrong direction. But remember, these are the very people that after some duration of time, they are the people who will come to us, spread the gospel to us. So that kind of notion, like how does so and so go about this thing and come again to me to preach? It brings a lot of questions like how is the future of the church tomorrow? I think that has greatly affected the percentage of participation in the church. And also another thing is concerning the content of the preaching during the Mass. You find, I don't know whether it's experienced in many places, but in a number of occasions, you find there are some churches, the Catholic churches, that you find they normally divert sometimes from the biblical teachings during preaching to financial teaching. Yeah, and they dwell so much on that. So if you find young generation, they'll be like, oh my God, if I don't have like money, then I'll be useless in the church. So definitely they'll say that, oh, let me wait until I'll become of age or when I'll be financially stable so that I can fully participate in the church activities. I think those are a number of activities that are greatly affecting the participation in the Catholic. And looking forward, I think if there can be regulations on the limitations of the content to be addressed during the service, I think that can really address that. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, there's two huge topics. I think in terms of, I mean, vocations is itself this huge topic. And, you know, if you've got falling, I mean, I think one of the biggest pastoral challenges facing the church at a kind of a structural level isn't so much the number of worshippers to the number of priests. We talk about a clergy shortage. And actually, if you think, well, we've got X number of priests versus number of people actually in the pews, in many places, it looks as good as it ever did. The trouble is that we're thinning out much fewer of both over an infrastructure that was built for kind of 4 times as many. So you'll end up with one priest looking after 3 churches with kind of each with a kind of a third of a viable congregation, right? And there's reasons why we don't close, no one wants to close parishes, and it never goes happily. No one's ever like, we're so glad that church closure was just a delight for all concerned. And says why bishops don't want to do it, but equally this becomes a real issue for clergy because you've got kind of 3 or 4 sets of drains, let alone everything else. And as I said before, you've got kind of 3 sets of people who, if they're in one church, it would feel full, it would feel packed, there'd be a critical mass for the choir, there'd be a critical mass of young people, there'd be a critical mass of families with young children, but we thin them out into 3 separate places and none of them ever feel like a viable community. So obviously, the trick there is, well, if we get the priests, we can keep the buildings open, and then once you've got once you've solved that problem, you can kind of sort out the issue. I think probably that's the wrong way to think about it. Is that it's a committed laity that produce the priests, and the difficulty is, as you say, is that given how few vocations there are going forward, there's probably always a temptation for religious congregations, particularly, but also dioceses, to think, yeah, we'll give them a go. This will probably be fine. But equally, I think probably the bigger issue that we have now with vocations is the kind of guys coming forward have to be super commit. Like they're kind of like, no one goes into like the diocesan clergy these days thinking, oh, it's kind of an easy life. I won't have to buy a drink in the big Boston parish. That'll be sent, and it's going to be amazing, and everyone will treat me with respect, and it's going to be wonderful, right? Like no one is going into the priesthood thinking that. So there's a sense in which anyone who is it's like kind of, they have to feel called, they have to be there for a reason, and it has to be a kind of a sense of sacrifice. And I'm not saying there aren't people who really kind of sort of for their own good, but more for the good of the community. Not that they're necessarily doing it kind of dishonestly, but actually there's people who just shouldn't be there, right? And you trust that the processes we have, Angela works at a seminary, I teach seminarians, you trust that the process that we have, weed those out before they get, doing damage somewhere. But I think the bigger issue with vocations isn't them, although when a priest goes bad, they can go very bad. And when a bishop goes bad, they can really, like, most of them don't, most of them are great, but when one does go bad, it can be catastrophic. But I think the bigger story about vocations these days is how impressive the guys going forward, or the girls, it's the same with religious vocations for women, which is but even fewer, so there's an even sense. I mean, certain congregations get, the Nashville Dominicans, whoever, get lots. But there's a sense in which no one is going into that kind of without really kind of feeling a kind of a very powerful sense. And I think the other issue about finance, I mean, it's partly the hand we dealt with, declining congregations, defining collection plates, old buildings that need repair. Money's always going to be an issue, and you're right that it then puts people off. But if you've got dioceses declaring bankruptcy because they've had to spend $800 million on payouts, well, you can say that, well, it would have been nice if the bishop 30 years ago didn't do that. But the hand you dealt at the minute, that's the reality. So, yeah.
So we will surely continue these discussions in our breakouts, and then, as I say, we won't pester you too much during lunch. Don't worry.